right, so our next speaker is our former colleague, Madeline Judge. She now hails from New Zealand, the University of Otago, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm so excited to be here and have this chance to speak to you. Thank you for coming. So the study I'm presenting today is in development, so I'm just presenting some initial insights, but hopefully you'll still find it interesting. So the general area that I'm interested in working in, which you can probably already tell, is this idea of the social psychology of sustainability transition. So as our speakers have already said, going beyond just looking at people as consumers or citizens and thinking more about systems and the role of people in those systems. And so one example that I work in is relating to shifts in food systems, for example. So then you might look at producers, consumers, but also financial sector, governments, and so on. And the particular part that I focus on is, as Lorraine mentioned, if you take this idea of the I frame and the S frame as the individual and the structure, there's been some arguments that there's also a G frame, which I think Young Willem had a paper talking about this as well. But between the individual and the system, there's also groups, and as social psychologists, we look a lot at this. So thinking about group processes, social norms, and social identities, and how those all function in this context. I'm just briefly mentioning this paper. I'm not going to go into details. I think maybe Young Willem's talk will speak more to this, but this paper is kind of thinking about what is the role of individuals, and particularly morally motivated individuals, in longer term societal change. And so we are proposing that morally motivated minorities or moral innovators initially sort of create some social frictions and some tensions, but then over time we might see society kind of shifting in that direction. And so just the reason I bring this up is that the paper, the research I'm talking about today, is kind of taking that idea and thinking what happens in a particular context. Can we apply that kind of notion to perhaps the context of policymaking and so on? And so I have this example here. As you probably are aware, The Hague was one of the first cities to ban fossil fuel related ads, but we are now seeing that this is happening in multiple cities around the world. So there's been a diffusion of this innovation across many countries. And how did that happen? Who was involved? How did they make that happen? I'm going to jump into another more specific topic, but one thing that I've been really keen on thinking about is people's sense of personal responsibility, and also within the context of these kind of collective action problems. So if you take climate change as an example, this is a problem that is caused by multiple people, that is going to take multiple people to address. And in such situations, it's really hard to kind of identify what your contribution is as an individual. And this is also known as the problem of many hands. And so, I have a list here of different types of responsibility, but I guess the one that I'm kind of really starting to get more interested in is this idea of how do people reason about their personal responsibility, their group's responsibility in these contexts of complex societal problems. And so you can think about maybe your group or you as an individual are causing some of the problem. You might be responsible for taking action to reduce it. Moral responsibility is sort of thinking about those in moral terms, and you could apply that to both causation or moral responsibility to fix something. And then you also have things like role responsibility. So people have responsibilities within their specific roles. You have also levels of responsibility. So again, you can think about your own personal individual responsibility or your responsibility as a collective. And that one I'm quite keen on looking more into, that idea of if you think your group's responsible, does that then make you feel like you should take action? And that kind of relates to the idea of collective efficacy and self-efficacy a bit. The last section here is just something I'm just reading about at the moment, but drawing from political science and economics, and thinking about how they talk about responsibility in terms of how society should be structured in a way to address complex problems. And so they talk about, one idea of setting up responsibility is to have it more centralised, have a top-down institution like a government that then directs and controls everybody else. You could have it market-based, so you provide market incentives and that shifts producers and consumers. Or you can have a polycentric approach where you would have multiple kind of independent authorities that are kind of governing their own little group or cluster, but then together those are working to govern society more generally. Okay, so how do actors actually perceive their own and others' responsibilities in addressing climate change? I said I was going to talk about government and council, but I'm going to just take a tangent and talk about vegans for a second. So this is just giving a bit more background around how I'm thinking about this, but a few years ago I published a paper looking at dietary behaviour as a potential form of collective action. So I drew on the social identity model of collective action and tried to apply it to this context. And I argued that, myself and colleagues argued that it's a different type of social movement that focuses more on trying to just convert people, maybe to convince them of your opinion, maybe to educate, rather than protesting on behalf of somebody's a group. And so therefore, it's also a context in which people may be reasoning about responsibility and maybe thinking about the problem in a more systemic way. And one thing that kind of bugs me about this is that a lot of social psych research in this area really frames it as vegans and meat eaters and how we don't like each other and all that kind of thing. And I just don't think, well, I'm going to argue that vegans potentially don't see it that way. It's more about this is a collective problem that we're all collectively responsible, and also there are multiple actors that need to take action. And so I asked vegans in that study what they thought were typical actions of vegans, and yeah, as you can see here, it's really not about protesting or campaigning. It's much more about these individualized behaviours and also advocacy and personal networks. I also asked them who they thought was responsible for the harm caused by animal agriculture. And, if they did have this impression it was just consumers, meat consumers, then you would have meat consumers really high and everybody else low. But you can see it's kind of, most people are seen as responsible apart from people who work as the factory workers in that system. So government, lobby groups, food companies, producers, but to a lesser extent, and consumers, all seen as responsible. The other thing that I was wondering was, even within the population, so I had a group of 340 vegans, but even within that, are there differences in how people understand this? And so are there some vegans who are like, it's just the meat eaters, or are there some people that are thinking more systemically? So I ran a cluster analysis at the moment, but the general pattern that I found here that I thought was kind of interesting is it seemed like there was about 3 clusters. The first one really emphasised what I would say are the powerful actors. So then you might, that might be a kind of lay theory around people who are responsible for harm are the most powerful people in society. So you've got governments and companies, industry, finance, and then everybody else a bit lower. The second one I would call like a market-based responsibility. So then the people in this system, which people are seeing as causing harm, the people that are most responsible are the consumers and the company. So that's kind of the lay theory there. But then you have the third group, which really doesn't make a lot of differentiation between the actors, and this is all standardized so you can see the differences. But when you look at it as a means, that's the group that's kind of rating everybody as highly responsible. And when I compared those groups across on their frequency of collective action, what I found was that it was the group that saw all the actors as responsible that was engaging the most in collective action. And I would argue that that's because the other kind of lay theories, they lead more towards, well, that's just big actors and I have no responsibility in that system, or I'm not able to influence that system so much, and maybe that's a little bit disempowering, but that could just be an assumption. I haven't dug into that yet. Okay, moving on to council actors. I've got 5 minutes, I think. So I've been working in New Zealand for a couple of years now, and I've been engaging with the local council. So I was working on some consultancy around how they could include behavioural shifts in their low carbon plan with our local council. And I really got interested in the kinds of people that are working in that space. And so I thought, could we look at these processes that I've been researching in that context? And particularly I find local councils a really interesting group because they have this long-term planning horizon, it's usually 30, 40, 50 years. They are in control of local infrastructure. So that, again, that comes back to that, what Lorraine was talking about the environment that people are in. And they have just direct interaction with people, which is quite different to centralised governments. And within councils, we in Aotearoa now have quite a lot of councils that have a climate specialist or a team. And that was sparked a few years ago by the school strikes for climate. So a lot of the schools came and protested in the climate, and the council said, okay, we listen to what you're saying, we'll put in a council specialist. So there's some kind of newish roles that of people that are advocating for climate in that context, and also are central to all these different kinds of networks, businesses, communities, government, etc. And although I have this assumption that people who are working in a role have to just follow the rules of the role, I think there's actually room for a lot of discretion, that they have a lot of chances to take more voluntary actions to do things that they want to do. So I would argue that maybe this is the context we can look at this kind of idea of those people as moral innovators or shifting things within that system. Just to give you a bit more of background on what's happening in our context at the moment, we are having a lot of natural disasters. We're having a storm every 8 days. In the last few months, we've had landslides that have had really bad impacts. We've had big floods. So this is our capital city, and we had this massive flood that made so much water that there were cars floating on the street. And we also have issues with particular areas of the country now becoming kind of labelled with too risky. Even like entire towns. So Westport now, most people in that town can't get insurance because their town has been seen as a flood risk. So there's a lot going on there, particularly in the adaptation space. And so the questions that I had for this study, I'm working in a very small country with a very small population, and within that there's just a tiny amount of people working in this space. So I'm just doing interviews at the moment. And I just had a few questions that I wanted to ask. I took, this is a smaller part of a bigger interview set, but I was thinking, how do local council staff negotiate who's responsible for taking climate action? How do they construct the role of councils in responding to the climate crisis? And how capable do they feel to take action both in their personal and work lives? So again, I just conducted 20 interviews at the moment across a range of different people in different roles and also different councils. But in general, the recruitment strategy was asking people who identify as in a climate-related role. I found that kind of interesting because I got one person who was just a policy planner who didn't have any official climate-related tasks, but she saw what she did as extremely climate-related, so she wanted to talk to me. So that kind of gets back to the idea, I think, of what is a climate role. And those are just some details about the coding process. And so the themes that I've been focusing on at the moment, firstly around perceived responsibility, I think one really dominant theme is people talking about the need for system change and also like explicitly rejecting the need, the focus on individuals. So saying, I'm really sick of everybody just focusing on the individual and the household who really need systems change, which probably sounds like a really familiar argument to all of us. But I found that the way that was being talked about was often also in quite a way that focused on the government as being responsible for that system change, which then also kind of led to a question to what is the role of that individual council staff member in trying to get the government to do that. People talking about powerful actors having causal responsibility. And then there were a few that were taking more of a less centralised approach. So they were saying councils should be taking the lead, maybe communities should be thinking about how they can build their responsibility. In terms of the role, there was a high focus on councils being responsible for adaptation, maybe more than mitigation. There was a lot of framing of councils as enablers rather than influencers, which I think is quite interesting. And then there was a lot of discussion on all the different constraints that they were working against there. And a lot of those were related to perceptions, so perceptions of the public not being supportive, perceptions of government not being supportive, elected councillors. A lot of different perceptions there. And also relating to the council staff, I found a lot of people saying, I'm doing this work because I care about it. This is just a part of my, almost like it's a climate action to be taking on that role. But also that role was quite hard on them a lot of the time. I came up with this little figure just to illustrate the different actors that people were talking about in their interviews. And what I find interesting is that we're mostly, so the solid lines are the people that they have sort of a direct interaction with and who they actually have the most influence on, and who are also influencing them. The ones with dotted lines, I think either they don't have such a direct influence on, or they're not, or they're just being influenced by it. And I find this interesting because a lot we're talking about, the responsibility of the central government, but they don't really have a direct line of influence there. And so, here's an example. If I say who's responsible for climate action, I think that sits firmly with central government. The challenge is one of systems change. Governments have the power and levers to enact significant change. Of course, active citizenship is important as well, but we need to get away from pointing fingers at individuals and households. While we all have opportunities to make change, central governments have the greatest opportunity to make their systems change. Here's an example of people talking about how powerful actors are causing this problem, and what comes alongside that is often things like we're failing at regulating this pretty miserably, there's not a lot we can do about this, so these kind of pessimistic comments. This is an example of someone talking more about responsibility of local council to maybe take leadership in this area. Local councillors should put their foot forward strongly to say what they believe in. And so you can see kind of a little bit of difference there around the way that people are framing responsibility. One of the key responsibilities that council staff said that they were responsible for was adaptation, and particularly that's being kind of driven top down by people worrying that they're going to get in trouble for people dying in their areas because they're not acting on climate disasters. This enabling versus influencing theme came through a bit, and I on the one hand, I think that's just part of the role. They provide funds for community groups to act, but the way that they understood that sometimes was that we're not just having a small impact on this community and the behaviours that they're doing, but we're creating a social license for bigger changes. So they see their role as kind of indirect a lot of the time. The last one's about their role with Māori, so tangata whenua is the local Māori, and so they're just enabling, they're not really directing. Again, there's a whole bunch of these constraints, and I won't actually go through all of it just because I'll run out of time, but some things are about how they felt like they needed a top-down mandate to take action, that they didn't feel like they had a lot to do with business because their role was about community well-being, that they couldn't talk about things that weren't directly to do with council, so they couldn't advocate for reducing flying because council owns the airport. They couldn't advocate for food change because council is responsible for waste, water, transport, so food seems weird to people. So there was this, I thought that was interesting. And there were some really interesting comments about how council wants to give householders information that their house is in a risk area, but the house doesn't want, the people don't want to hear that because that lowers the value of their house. So then they come back with their own research and start and confront the council, and now the council is too scared to talk about it. So there's this vicious cycle going on there. Council staff often said they were kind of intrinsically motivated to do what they're doing. It's my personal decision to work here. I don't separate it from my personal life and my advocacy. And there was a lot of also, I think, evidence of people doing things beyond their role. So I'm building a network of professionals. I'm advocating not just locally but across the globe. I participate in forums. I influenced my council to create a whole team. So I was just the only person, and then I made it become a whole team. I think there's some evidence that they're sort of creating these innovations and trying to spread them. And then lastly, there was a lot of people who was talking about how this is actually a really difficult role. It was quite frustrating a lot of the time. A lot of these, though, again, I think I could see they were kind of linked to that perception that government should be taking action and they aren't. So our government at the moment is just cutting all of the environmental policies that they can and actually attacking councils. So there's currently regional councils, but the government has said that those now need to shut down and become just represented by a single mayor. Okay, so just to summarise, narratives around who is responsible might have implications for council staff's social change strategies and sense of self-efficacy. That perceptions act as constraints on action, as well as those actual constraints that they're dealing with. So there might be some, if we talk about this misperceptions literature, there's some scope there that we could help with maybe correcting as misperceptions. And that council staff you could conceptualise maybe as moral invaders, and in a formal network who can help to diffuse policy innovations. Of course, my context is very limited to my specific country, and I did not have a lot of representation for people who weren't active on climate change. We are currently trying to build an Australia-New Zealand environmental psychology network. We've had 2 pre-conferences at our local psychology conference, and I just wanted to share that with you, that that's in development and coming soon, so keep your eyes out for that. And we would love to collaborate more. Yes, and if anybody is interested in these topics and interested in collaborating, I'd love to hear from you as well. Okay. Thank you.